Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 273, Trans and Jewish World Building. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rothberg.
And before we start our episode today, we want to invite everybody who's listening to join us for our upcoming Shavuot extravaganza. Now, Shavuot is Lex's favorite holiday, and it's a holiday that I like very much as well. There are agricultural roots of the holiday, as there are for many Jewish holidays, and in Rabbinic Judaism, Shavuot is meant to be a holiday that marks the revelation of the Torah at Mount Sinai. Whether you believe that that story is a myth or that story really happened, this is the day on the calendar that is meant to mark the day when the revelation at Sinai happened. And for at least a few hundred years, there has been a tradition to stay up all night studying Torah. Last year, in part because of COVID and because everybody was now in different time zones and all online, we experimented with this idea that not only would we stay up all night studying Torah, but we'd actually stay up all night and the whole rest of the day. And we ended up having a 24, or maybe it was a 25-hour Shavuot extravaganza, where each hour we had somebody else leading a session. Sometimes it was a more formal study session, and many times it was more of a discussion or presenting some ideas and talking about them. And I think people really had a great experience. And because of that, we're actually doing it again this year, and we're actually making it even longer, 30 hours. Now, this year, Shavuot technically starts on Sunday, May 16th at night, and that means that the next day would be a Monday. And we know that a lot of people aren't going to be able to or aren't going to want to spend the whole day Monday studying with us. They might have work. They might have other things that they have to do on a weekday. So we thought that we would actually back it up, and we are doing our 30-hour extravaganza starting on Saturday night, May 15th, at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, all the way through 11:59 p.m. the next day, Sunday, May 16th. You can come for all 30 hours, but you don't have to. You could just come for 1 hour. You could come for 5 hours. You could come for 10 hours. You could come for 12 hours. Anyway, I'm not going to go on like that. But we have so many people joining us to teach and to lead during this time. A lot of our previous guests. So it's really going to be a great event. Last year, we had something like 800 people there over the course of the event. And this year, we're hoping that it's going to be even more, including you. So to register for the event, go to www.judaismunbound.com/Shavuot. That's SHAVUOT. And you will get a Zoom link to the event, and you'll be able to join us at any point that you want over the course of those 30 hours. We're really excited about it, and we're really excited to see you there. The event is absolutely free, but of course, we always welcome donations, which you can make at www.judaismunbound.com/donate. Now let's jump into today's episode, which is also the beginning of a new series on the subject of Jews and the trans experience. We've had a number of interviews already with folks who are trans, and we're really excited to be launching this whole series exploring those interconnections and what they help us understand about folks who are trans and how they relate to Judaism. And we think that you'll find a lot of things that flow from the unique experiences and understandings of folks who are trans and working to build Jewish lives for themselves and for others. Today, for our first episode in the series, we're talking with two folks who are really wonderful first people to talk to about this. They're good friends of mine through our work together with Svara. Remember, that's B'nai Lappy's traditionally radical yeshiva, through which they are working on a project called the Trans Halacha Project. I'm going to read you a little bit of its self-description. Over the past decade, the Jewish community has been blessed with the increased visibility of trans, intersex, non-binary, and gender non-conforming folks in our communities. The unique lives, bodies, and experiences of this growing subset of our community demands a new halacha, pathways and practices of Jewish expression. The Trans Halacha Project aims to curate existing resources that have been developed for trans Jews and by trans Jews, identify new areas of halacha that have yet to be developed, and finally, to create opportunities for developing new halachic literature and practice guides that speak directly to these areas of need. Our guests today are Becky Silverstein and Laynie Soloman. Becky Silverstein is the founder of Bein Kodesh L'Chol, a Jewish communal project in Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. He also serves as the rabbi-in-residence for Keshet, LGBTQ and ally Teen Shabbatonim, and is a fellow in the Svara Transformative Talmud Teaching Fellowship. Becky is also the chair of the board of Svara and the chair of the board of the Jewish Studio Project. He grew up in New York and holds a BS in engineering science, as well as rabbinical ordination from the Rabbinical School of Hebrew College. Laynie Soloman is the associate Rosh Yeshiva and director of transformative leadership at Svara. They hold an MA in Jewish education from the Jewish Theological Seminary and received the Covenant Foundation's 2020 Pomegranate Prize for Emerging Jewish Leaders. Laynie Soloman is also a Schusterman Fellow. Becky Silverstein, Laynie Soloman, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
So glad to be here.
Yeah, totally great to be here.
Well, I'll have a very simple question to start off with. So can you just tell us a little bit about the Trans Halacha Project and what that's all about? Also, do you pronounce it Trans Halacha Project or Trans Halacha Project?
I'll leave the pronunciation question to Laynie when we get there. But even before we jump in on what the project is, maybe we'll just define our terms here, right? Maybe we'll just define trans and then we'll pass it over to Laynie to pronounce and define halacha for us. So what does it mean that this is a trans project? How do we define trans for ourselves? And I think this is a definition too that one can use in the wider world, right? Where trans or transgender is used as an umbrella term for anyone who knows themselves to be a gender that's different than the gender they were assigned at birth. Folks may be like, gender assigned at birth, what does that mean? Is this a thing we still do in our world? And of course it is, right? Like, people give birth, we look at the babies, we look at their genitalia, and we say, it's a boy, it's a girl, and assign a particular gender based on those primary sex characteristics.
And then we started a forest fire.
That's right. And then we start a forest fire. That actually happens a few months before birth when we're announcing the child's gender even before they're born. To be honest, I'm so done with the conversation about gender reveal parties. If I never have to hear about another one, it would be amazing.
Dianu.
Yeah, Dianu for
We'll start
sure.
that right here. Anyway, go on. Sorry.
No, yeah. And so we know that when people say it's a boy or it's a girl, that folks, as they're growing up and moving through the world, sometimes they're like, oh, these words, boy, girl, man, woman, that are constructed in the cultures in which we grow up, don't actually feel right to us. They don't match my internal sense of self. And those folks may choose to identify as transgender. So this is a project, right? The Trans Halacha Project, focused on the experience of transgender people. And it's a project facilitated by and largely participated in by trans folks as well.
Can I just ask you one other clarifying question that I think will be helpful for some listeners? That I think that a lot of folks who grew up, a generation or two ago think of transgender as like it's still a binary. And so if you weren't the gender that you were assigned at birth, then you must be the other gender. But there's a lot of an understanding today that it's not like that.
Yeah. So trans experience represents a wide range of gender conception. That could be someone sort of jumping from two sides of a binary, which I don't think really exists, right? This binary of men and women. Or it could be someone placing themselves along a spectrum in a galaxy of gender, outside of anything we know about gender. And generally people are using the terms there like non-binary, or you might hear someone say I'm NB, which is a pronunciation of the letters NB of non-binary. And generally, I'll just say also that one thing that feels important to us in the context of our project, and to, I think actually to both of us more broadly, is not to be policing the term transgender really at all. And I would love a better metaphor there than the word policing. Not to be drawing a boundary around who can or can't identify as transgender. If someone tells me they're trans, I'm not going to question that at all. I'm going to say like, cool, great. Would love to know what your life is like and how it intersects with halacha.
And just to clarify the halacha part now, that so we had the pronunciation question, of course. So we get to hear takes related to that, but more broadly, we've talked a little bit about this word in the past, and we've heard different definitions from guests around what halakha means. Most of them start by saying, "I don't mean it as Jewish law," because we like guests that question. Many people do think of it as Jewish law, but I'm curious how you, Laynie, or how this project, the Trans Halacha project, conceives of that term.
Perfect. And I'm going to say trans halacha moving forward, but y'all should collectively know that we hold space for many pronunciations. We're a project born out of Svara. So y'all know that multiplicity is
I
key.
didn't mean that to be the fault line of this episode, but maybe actually there is some symbolism there. So let's go with it.
It's good. We similarly don't regulate how people pronounce words, just as we don't regulate what they do or how they define their bodies. Thank God. So the way we're operating with a sort of like foundational understanding and shared framework of halacha together, and this is what we think today, and maybe tomorrow we might think something different, is that we're sort of defining and being guided by a definition and an understanding of halacha as a language for Jewish action and expression and values, and a language that's situated within any particular worldview, as language always is. So if halacha is the Jewish language for action and articulating values and what we do and how we feel, the worldview that the Trans Halacha Project is situated in is the worldview of trans experiences. So whether that's individual experiences or communal experiences of transness, that's how this project is sort of understanding what we're up to.
So can you talk a little bit about what would be the outcome that you would imagine being the thing that this project has produced an outcome, and now we have a trans halacha? Like, what is that? What does that all look like? And then also, what is the process itself of arriving there?
First and foremost, right, we hope to provide concrete resources to trans Jews that will nurture affirming and joyful pathways into Jewish expression, right? We want to engage trans Jews in the questions of what does this Jewish language for action mean in your lives? And how does it help you live a rich, deep, meaningful spiritual life in this world? Within that, we're doing, I would say, three things. One seems very concrete in my mind, which is collecting ritual resources that have already been created, or perhaps asking folks to create new resources that are by and for trans people, right? So resources around name change, around gender affirming surgeries, around taking hormones, around using new names, or any number of other moments that are sort of trans life cycle moments. One of the things that happens in my life as a trans rabbi, there are, thank God, many of us now, but like folks email and are like, I have a conversion student who's trans and I don't know what to do about this, right? And they were assigned female at birth, but they're a trans man. And do we do Hatafat Dam Brit? Do we not? Is there a ceremony from it? The truth is, at this point, like I've done, I don't know, half a dozen, maybe one or two more of this type of ritual. And so let's create a rabbinic handbook that doesn't need to just be used by rabbis. It's just the model I have in my head that says, like, this is what you do in these moments. And it's very comforting when that comes in a PDF. So that's the hope. The second part is to ask trans Jews what their experience with halacha is at this moment. What's their relationship to it? Is it a pain point or is it a place of real nurturing? And that also is while binary is a false one. Right now, we're currently surveying trans Jews, and we have 145, 143, something like that, survey respondents, hoping to get to 150 to ask those questions. And then we'll look at that data with S.J. Krasnow, who's a professor of theology at Rutgers University, to help us do some of the data stuff. I'm a rabbi, not a sociologist. They're a sociologist. And then the third part is to respond to whatever data we collect. And I forgot a fourth piece, actually, which is contributing to a larger discourse around halacha. What is it that the worldview of being trans can add to this rich conversation that's been part of guiding the Jewish people for a long time now?
I love that last piece especially. I mean, I love all the pieces you talked about, but Also, one thing, I love that you made this distinction between I'm a rabbi and not a sociologist. Like, one day may more rabbis actually understand that there's a difference between those things and that there may be ramifications for where our expertise ends. Putting that aside. But
there's so many wonderful blessings being made today.
Yes, one day we'll have that world. It's certainly not yet. But the piece you mentioned about how this has ramifications, not just with, the really important, but the small questions about what do I do in XYZ situation and show, like, I'll speak for myself. Like, one practical question that comes up, say, is, people are being called to the Torah, and they are usually called in a traditional Jewish context as their Hebrew name, Ben or Bat, their parents' name. Ben meaning son, Bat meaning daughter. And the question comes up, if somebody is non-binary and is neither a Ben or a Bat, neither a son or a daughter, what would you say? And one beautiful, I don't know if solution is, one beautiful answer that people have offered is mi beit, which is, from the house of. And I'll tell you, I do identify as a cisgender male. Ben is not inaccurate for me, but there's something about mi beit, from the house of, that is an intimacy. Like, there's something about it that I really like. And I've actually asked to be called up that way sometimes when I'm reading Torah, because from the house of Rachel v'Pesach Kiva, my parents' names, like, I don't know, it works for me. And so I'm curious if there's other ways that sort of situation is a stand-in for a much broader paradigm where what you're doing with the Trans Halacha project on a practical level actually shifts the game for far beyond just people who themselves are trans.
For sure. Just immediately in thinking about that example, the question isn't, can we call non-binary people up to the Torah, yes or no? The question is, how do we find the way that feels maximally aligned and euphoric for non-binary people to be called to the Torah? And so even the way you phrase the question, Lex, I think is at the heart of what this project is about, which is to shift our mindset from imagining that halacha is a series of yes or no questions with yes or no answers, and expanding our understanding to halacha as the way through which the language we use, the way we describe what we're doing. So it is both the solution, quote unquote, and also the expression of the question and the space to ask it from an expansive place. So I think that's one of the biggest gifts that trans experiences can offer broader conversations about yes or no frameworks of things, is that trans folks are a blessing to the world in our rejection of binary frameworks. The yes and no questions of halacha are nonsensical in many ways and also not useful for many people in lots of arenas. What we're trying to do is offer a different picture here.
The me bait example is interesting too, because it highlights, right? Like, it also highlights a question about where do people situate themselves vis-a-vis from where they came. It explodes how we are connected to our most immediate ancestors, right? Typically parents, but also what does it mean to be from a house and not from two people or one person? What does it mean? My spouse's Hebrew name has her mom, her dad, and her stepmom all after bat, right? And so how does that change things? And there are I know of at least two people who use misera so-and-so, from the seed of so-and-so, because they know they're sperm donors. Mi-bait solves both a technical question of how do we do this in a way that fits nicely into our paradigm for this particular ritual of calling someone up to Torah, but also it has embedded in it a larger question about family structure and who is raising us, or who has brought us to this moment of coming to Torah, who has brought us to this moment of covenant and helped shape who we are in this interaction that we're about to have between us and the community and the Torah. And if you're a God person, God. So, yeah.
What I'm curious about is, like, if we couldn't use the word halacha in this conversation, what word would we use instead? Because, like, what I'm wondering is, are we talking about the subset of Jews and the subset of trans Jews who are kind of traditional, and it appeals to them to live in a world of what we might call halacha in a traditional way. Like there's a Jewish way of doing things, whether you call it law or you call it something not quite law, but it's like there's a right Jewish way to do things. And we, obviously, that right way, when it's built in a world of a binary gender, isn't going to work for people who are trans. And so what we're trying to do here is figure out how trans people who want to live in that world of Jewish law can do so, effectively and with honor, et cetera, et cetera. Or are we, and I suppose we're probably breaking down this binary too, I'm sure, is it really that we actually want to expand our understanding of what the word halacha is all about, and that we're not talking about only that subset of Jews who is very eager to live in a kind of rule-based Jewish way, but no, we're actually trying to talk about a Jewish path, which may be actually many paths. And really the project of a trans halacha project is really a project about making the word halacha able to be embraced by every Jew in the world as well, because it's not what you thought it was.
Yes, and this project is both. This project is both designed to support trans Jews who are living within a quote unquote binding framework of halacha in traditionally normative communities, whatever that means to them, to make it easier for them to live their lives or for us to live our lives, and is designed to expand what halacha means to support folks who could never have seen themselves as engaging in or participating in a halachic project, to see the possibility there through expanding what we're talking about at the end of the day. So I think it's both in the plainest sense.
At the Trans Jews Are Here convening, I taught this session on obligation, which went off the rails of my plan very quickly, as people very quickly questioned just like, what does it mean? What are we obligated to? What if the system has done harm? Why would we use the term halacha when it is framed between a community that doesn't see me and that I might not see myself within? Halacha is walks a line between individual experiences and communal experiences. And queer Jews and trans Jews in particular need space to say, this covenant wasn't designed with me in mind, or it was, and I felt erased by it in many ways. And so I want back in.
I really love asking big questions about halacha. So I'm just going to stick there. I have been nobody knows I do this. I have occasionally done a thing where I have staked out a position as being anti-halachic or ahalachic. And I want to explain why, because I think when I say that sometimes people think I'm just being like, rebel, like let's be the anti-person. And here's a main reason. When I have conversations with folks about halacha, we talk about a lot of beautiful eras in history, a lot of beautiful Jewish texts. We don't talk about Emma Goldman, Jewish activist. We don't talk about Philo, usually, who sort of fused Greek and Jewish ideas. We don't talk about, well, actually, maybe sometimes we talk about Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, but usually not. We're talking about sort of a specific realm within the broad ecosystem of Jewish stuff that it's not, I think people are right. It's not just Jewish law, right? But it's sort of how to do religious things and religious is hard to define, but how to do ritual obligations, to use that word again, in various eras, various times. And as somebody who feels very strongly that if we're really gonna build a Judaism that resonates with Jews and maybe even Jewish adjacent people, I feel that it needs to not just be focused on that realm. Basically, I'm concerned about terms that place the conversation in a narrow place. And I think halacha can sometimes do that, because as much as we're trying to change what it means, it has been rabbinical schools talk about halacha. Academic programs talk about halacha. People watching Marvelous Mrs. Maisel less often talk about halacha. And so I'm curious, would you push me on that? Do you agree with that? How do you orient to halacha as sort of one part of the whole? And are there ways in which the Trans Halacha Project might be doing some things even beyond just halacha?
Yeah, so we could have called this project the Trans Ritual Project, which could have worked. I think that terminology could have worked. That was an idea we were tossing around and thinking about, okay, should we call this the trans ritual project or a trans ritual project? We don't need a definitive "the" there. A reason to move in the direction of calling something a halacha project is because halacha is not just about what people do. It's about how we talk about what we do. So I would argue that there is space in an articulation of any halachic framework for Emma Goldman, thank God, that we should absolutely be incorporating the fullness of who we are and the fullness of our expressions and our ideals and the world building that we want to do. That is halacha. Halacha is the practice of world building, which includes doing stuff and also the way we talk about the stuff that we do. For some of that, we can check out Robert Cover's idea of nomos and narrative is contained within law, that we do stuff and we tell a story about it. This piece about halacha as world building, I think, is important also to situate within the fact that this project, the Trans Halacha Project, is housed at Svara. Svara has always been about empowering players, where folks who have been on the margins become the active shapers, creators, makers, builders of this tradition. That has always happened at Svara, most primarily through Talmud. And what we're doing with this project is just expanding the field that folks are playing on and playing in and through and with.
So world building. Okay, I love world building. I'm not sure, I'm still not sure I'm going to call it halakha, but I love world building. So let's sit with world building. First off, I just flashed to a famous little 3-word phrase that has been melodicized in Hebrew, Olam Chesed Yibaneh, a world of kindness, of chesed, God will build. But turns out not everybody likes thinking of it as only God's going to build that. So we've got a melody that says we're going to build that world. So world building is right up my alley. And so I'm actually curious to hear more of like what that means to you. Because when I think of world building, I've talked about this in other episodes of the podcast. I think of like the Marvel Cinematic Universe that weaves a world through cinema, like fictional. My mind goes to like literature and film, which I'm not saying to say like, why are you using the word world building? I'm actually saying that because I like that you're using the word world building. And so I'm curious though, like, do you see your like partners in crime in this project or your peers as being like Marvel Cinematic Universe or those kinds of weavers of worlds that are doing it in literary or cinematic ways? Like what does world building mean to y'all?
2 things are coming to mind for me. One is a question that gets asked often in a Svara context, which is who do the rabbis want us to be? What does the process of learning Talmud and learning a particular piece of Talmud, how does it train us, right? It trains us with an eye towards process. It trains us with an eye towards perhaps history or compassion, relationship to the world around us, depending on what a particular text is. And so I think halacha is the next step past that. How do the rabbis and how does a set of actions that express our values orient us to the world in which we live and thus change actually that world? If what we're doing is being oriented to the world around us with an acknowledgement of our communal history of being slaves in Egypt, with an eye to communal mythological experience of servitude or of slavery, right? Then that trains us to have our hearts open to folks who are in this moment experiencing oppression of a variety of things. If we are taking on the rabbinic experiment of saying 100 brachot a day, we're probably saying brachot over eating, among other things, right? That train us to be aware of our embodied experience of how we're literally moving through the world. And so how does that actually change the world then, right? How does it change the world when we say a bracha over a blessing over a piece of fruit? And I don't have a direct, like from A to B on that one, at least, but it does, I think, build a world where we are paying attention to what is outside our Dalet Amot, if you will, outside our 4 units of measure that is our sphere of the world.
When I think of world building, I think of the Marvel Cinematic Universe or Marvel Comics. I think of Lord of the Rings, and I think of the Talmud. The whole project of what we are doing when we're studying Talmud is we're participating in a world that was constructed by the rabbis in order to both like live out a fantasy life, but also to really co-create Olam Hazeh, this world, in a way that felt like Olam Haba, their inch towards their fantasy world of the world that we're trying to bring into being. Living in the tension between this world and the next world is what fantasy is and is what ritual is. And we're here to argue also is what halacha is.
This is making me think of some conversations that B'nai Lappi and I have been having recently on the show that we do together, the Oral Talmud, where B'nai is often thinking about how here's the world that the rabbis were trying to create, the rabbis of the Talmud. And we are trying to kind of build on their world. We're trying to celebrate how brilliant they were and how much we appreciate and hold their values and want to make sure that we're creating the most resonant contemporary manifestation of that. And then I will often emphasize something that, in my view, I learned from B'nai, that the rabbis have actually created this manual for us of what to do when their own system breaks down. And maybe their system is breaking down because their world that they constructed just isn't our world anymore. And so the challenge that they're laying down to us is to build a new world. And the way that I've been trying to grapple with that in terms of trans experience is, that there's certain elements of the worldview of the rabbis, arguably and probably of no fault of their own. They were just concepts that they weren't familiar with, but they built this world where the gender binary, for example, is just kind of built into it. And so how do you approach that once either you don't fit into that, or more broadly, we just don't believe that human beings fit into that, and say, okay, so what is our relationship to it? And it feels to me like the more that we stay close to the concepts that they laid down, like halacha, the more we kind of are giving them credit that we like the world that they built, but then when you look at something where like their view of gender was so different from our view of gender, then how do I really not look at that and say, well, maybe they had a lot of other ideas that weren't right?
The thing that is coming up for me, Dan, is an experience that I've had, I don't know, maybe a handful of times in a variety of different learning environments, which is sharing with a group of learners the list of 8 rabbinic sexes or maybe genders, maybe sexes that are used in ways in which we understand gender throughout the Talmud in particular, and having people try and map our modern identities back onto them, right? And so for listeners who aren't sure what I'm talking about, right, you can find a list of genders or sexes in the Talmud, like the tumtum or the androgynous or the ilonit. And I'm not going to go through all of them and what all of them map onto. But I think that's actually not the project. The project isn't to say, oh, look, the rabbis described these groups of people in relationship to their bodies. And we also, one way we describe our experience is in relationship to our bodies. And so we are the modern day androgynous. And I say that because it's not a thing that I find compelling, and also want to name that it is a thing that people do and find meaning in. And I'm glad for that for them.
It's true that the rabbis live in a world and have in many ways constructed a world that in moments is misaligned with our values. Thank God, many of our values have grown and expanded and become a lot better. Yay. And also there can be a sense of an illusion of progress that leads us to undermine the existence of transness, which is like, these are not new questions that just popped out of the 21st century in somewhere right here on the internet on Zoom. These are questions about what it means to be a human being and how we live out our experiences of gender that have been core to being human forever. And so it's true, there are ways in which we can sort of reconstruct images of who we may have been by looking at the rabbis. But I think what's most important for me is actually what I'm invested in is not finding the places where other people told stories about us, but creating the opportunities. What's new is that we're telling the stories and that those are getting written down. We have always existed and we have always been telling stories about ourselves, but they just didn't get written down. What did get written down was other people's experiences of who we are, which don't resonate with me because they're not actually for me. They're just about me. And in this sense, I think it's useful to bring in a framework that we've been talking about a bunch, which is the distinction between dysphoric halakha and euphoric halakha. Dysphoric halakha is trying to solve, quote unquote, the quote unquote problems that trans people and trans bodies present to the halachic system in its normative framework. Those are questions like, can trans people, can blah, 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 yes or no, can this other person do this thing in my space? Those are dysphoric questions. What we're interested in is euphoric questions and euphoric frameworks of being, which is not the problems that trans people are presenting, but the gifts and the moments of euphoria that trans people are finding in deep alignment with the Torah. Where do we feel euphoric when we come into contact with Yiddishkeit, as my Bobby would say, Jewishness?
I want to really build on that in my question, I guess, about what we were talking about earlier, which is a little bit like the ways in which the project that you're engaged in here is actually ultimately, or one day will be so much bigger than what it sounds like it is today. And one way to think about that is what we were saying earlier about the mibate, that there will be a lot of us who don't understand ourselves to be trans who will find things that you're creating through this project that speak to us more powerfully than anything we've experienced otherwise, and that's a great gift to others. But there's something beyond that as well, which is that B'nai has also been sharing with me lately these studies that show that today there's one that says 1/3 and there's one that 2/3 of folks in Generation Z, the young kids these days, that they are in some fashion queer, that when they ask them, what is your gender identity or what is your sexual orientation, they're not saying it's firmly one or the other. In other words, they're not saying that they're trans or that they're gay or whatever. It's just that they're not quite saying that they're what their gender assigned at birth might be or their assumed sexual orientation might be, et cetera, et cetera. I think that that's just the tip of the spear. It feels to me like, based on talking to my kids and understanding just how my kids look at gender, so different from how I did and how I did was different from how my parents did, that part of this is just an opening up of plausibility structures for people and even understanding that certain things are possible that we certainly weren't taught by our parents or by the Talmud. And so I wonder if ultimately this project that you're embarked on has the potential to become the halakha, right? Like not the trans halakha, but like the normative halakha, in the sense that the vast majority of Jews will understand themselves to be not conforming to a gender binary, because the vast majority of human beings will see that, right? And so it's a question of, I guess you could think of it as like disruptive innovation versus sustaining innovation in a way. It's like saying that this thing that's going on in this little, this little corner actually turns out to be the most important thing that's going to happen. And I just wonder if you think about things like that, if you're conscious, if you don't agree with it.
I try not to think about it. I find it very overwhelming. Two things are coming to mind, Dan. One is Evan Masu Habonim Haita LaRoche Pina. The stone that has been discarded has been brought into the center. It's from one of the Psalms, and just acknowledging that experience is recorded in our canon already. And the second is my own personal experience of being a trans elder, which is a weird thing to say because I'm only 39. And the first time I was called a trans elder was at Svara's Queer Talmud camp, when a group of trans folks who had come together to camp were like, we've never met a trans person over the age of 30. I was like, wow. And thank God I have my own trans elders. And there are people who have opened the door for the work of the Trans Halacha Project over the past, decades, centuries. But yeah, like what is available to me, or in terms of language and experience and of the world, that is, or rather the other way, what is available to folks who are younger than I am, right? So the teenagers who I work with on Keshet Shabbatonim, or the college students who I've mentored in different moments, is so different, right? And the word that Sfar uses, right, that B'nai used in the crash talk, and that, right, is unrecognizable. That I didn't know what was coming down the pike 20 years behind me in trans identity. And I find it very overwhelming to think about what halakha might look like in 20 years because of the work that we're doing. Very concretely, the work that I think we're doing is making space for trans Jews to have affirming, celebratory experiences of Judaism. Now, I say that, and I also have a deeply held theological belief, which is that the Torah needs trans Jews and Jews of color and Jews with disabilities and Jews of a variety of class backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds and all sorts of experiences. We need all of those experiences to learn Torah, Talmud, and all of our texts to keep it alive and vibrant. I sit in that tension all the time.
I started noticing a few years ago that forgetting spaces that identify actively as queer Jewish spaces, actually putting those aside for a second, when I spend time in like vibrant Jewish communities that are younger people, like they're queer spaces. They're not always calling themselves that, but like there's a lot of people in this. Maybe this is the spaces I happen to be part of. I also live in a city, Providence, that has a lot of really wonderful queer Jews and queer people. But like based on my experience in some of these spaces that don't necessarily lead with we're a queer space, but do have many wonderful queer people leading them, like end of the day, they're fun spaces. They're joyous spaces. They are thoughtful spaces.
Yeah, they're the best.
Right. Like we had a moment earlier this year where like we planned our Purim program and we reached out to, we partnered with a wonderful organization, the Torah Studio. And like we reached out to folks to take on a chapter each of the Book of Esther. And like I looked down at who we reached out to, like turns out majority queer and trans presenters. And I'm not saying that to pat ourselves on the back. I really think that that's something that is logically going to happen if we are actually noticing what the work that's being done, the changes that are underway. So like, I guess I was curious, this is another version of something we've asked a couple times, but just we really believe that what you're doing has the potential to be part of something, I don't know the right metaphor, open the floodgates, like to be part of something that will in 100 years be something that has drastically shifted. So what would you say for communities that might not be thinking of themselves as queer communities, but who are looking to learn from you, looking to be changed by the work that you're doing?
The metaphor is Bo Bayom, is on that day, which is a reference to a sugya in the Talmud about the gates of the Beit Midrash being thrown open and benches being added to the back. And this, what was a sort of elitist institution, being opened wide to whomever wanted to come in and learn. And the ways in which that changes the nature of dialogue between folks who are learning Torah in that particular context. So there's a Talmud nerd who's listening can go down that rabbit hole there. The other thing I want to say is that the work that we're doing may be part of this, a rebuilding from the crash, or part of a revolution, part of a renewal, rebirth, reconstructing, pick your popular term, of Judaism. And it has already saved individual lives. And so in the ways in which saving a life is the equivalent of saving the world, or saving a life is about building a world or allowing a part of a world that wouldn't exist to continue existing, the work that we have done has already done that. And so I'm tremendously proud of what it means to be part of an organization, Sfara or many others, and to be part of a project that comes to Judaism and comes to halacha or Talmud with a frame of mind that says, how can I locate myself in this? How can I do that with a sense of joy? How can I acknowledge when it's a source of pain? How can I share this out into the world and use it to build, right, to build a world of chesed, a world of overflowing kindness, or a world of justice, a world of equity. And that's what I would say to people, which is like approach our holy tradition that way and approach our community that way, as if each person has something to teach us and has a whole world to bring to bear that we need to listen to and engage with and be curious about. And if that doesn't happen, I carry very deeply, and I'm tearing up because it's actually hard for me to sit with the reality of having saved people's lives and knowing the work that brought me to this moment has saved people's lives. If the larger Torah revolution doesn't happen, there are trans Jews who are alive today who are going to make something new and build a different world regardless.
I think for me, what this brings up is sort of like this question of whether takana, legislation as a source of law, is actually effective, or whether it's minhag, custom, i.e. what the people are doing, that drives the legal process. You can't actually have a takana if no one will follow it. And it seems, according to a lot of legal scholars, that takana, legislation, is only just there to ordain that which the people are already doing, the minhag. And so what feels really outrageous to me is that there is a moment in which there are trans minhagim that we know about, that are visible, that people do. Mi beit is a perfect example of that, as y'all brought up. Nala amod, ways of calling people to the Torah that are non-gendered in broad sense. There are dozens that we could name in this conversation, that there is a powerful trans minhag and or trans minhagim, multivocal and with many expressions, which is incredible. And that isn't the work of a project or of a person. That's the work of the groundswell grassroots of trans people for generations, fighting and surviving and carving paths out of tradition and navigating horrible conditions to learn and becoming resilient and also dying and then surviving. Like, all of that is part of what has enabled this moment of real minhag to emerge. And it feels like a powerful gift to be able to steward some of the takana that comes after that.
Yeah, that's such a helpful way to look at just Jews more broadly and to say, rather than what we assume is the perspective of halakha, which is like, this is how you're supposed to do it, and all you Jews out there, you're doing it wrong. Let me tell you how to do it right. Instead, that the orientation would be to go out there and say, hey, let me look at what Jews are doing, and at least presume that there's a good chance that what they're doing is actually something that they should be doing, as opposed to something they shouldn't be doing. And if what they're doing doesn't accord with the halakha as I understand it, then at least it's worth investigating. Maybe the halakha needs to change, or maybe what they're, and by the way, maybe that's not contrary to the tradition. That is the tradition. There's something that's been on my mind that's not directly related to halakha or the Trans Halakha Project, but that's related to transness and to potentially learning from the trans experience, which is the question of the binary of Jew and non-Jew. And I'm wondering whether your experience, your thoughts about trans folks in Judaism or trans folks in general helps maybe us think about that in a new way. I mean, I could share, and I guess I will in the future, like what I think about it, but it feels to me like the world in which we live now, the clean line between Jew and non-Jew is not a clean line, and people don't know what to do with that. And I'm wondering whether there's something that we can learn from the trans world.
The question that comes up for me here, Dan, is what feels meaningful about that distinction to people between Jew and non-Jew? And I could put out any number of things that feel meaningful. And something I've learned from my own trans experience is that I don't have to necessarily be consistent about my gender, right? I don't have to be consistent about what pieces of masculinity I take on or don't take on, for example. And so I think I want to push on folks to say, like, let's figure out the places of meaning and lean into them and unpack those. And also hold loosely the rest of it. And sometimes it's uncomfortable. Journeying is uncomfortable. And trans folks, among many, many other folks, have that experience and hold that in their bodies. So too, I think actually probably the Jewish people.
As we close out, I mean, this has been so beautiful to soak in. What, as you sit with this work that you're just beginning now, that we've all agreed is a project not just of the next, few months or few years, but maybe of many, many generations, what would you hope folks are sitting with as they continue on with whatever's next?
In engaging in the early moments of this project, I keep noticing and am constantly reminded of the ways in which trans people actually just gift the world with an incredible thing, which is the upfront naming and centering of self-determination and choice and self-actualization. Upfront, here it is, this is what's true. And I'm thinking and have been thinking as we've been engaged in this project about the ways in which so many communities thrive on erasing that choice and the ways in which transness pushes back against that erasure and centers our ability to determine who we are, to declare who we are, and to make choices actively about who we are. I'm excited about a religious world that centers that and that uplifts that and notices that, not only for trans people, but for all people as the gift that trans folks are offering us, perhaps.
I am sitting deeply with the question of who am I to do this work? What does it mean to be a rabbi? What does it mean to be a trans person? What does it mean to be queer? What does it mean to have access to financial resources that can support this work? Just who am I to be in this position to open up these conversations? And I think the thing I want to leave people with is that I am sitting with the question without an expectation of the answer. And that I think one way in which Judaism can grow is if we all sort of let go of this, who am I to be doing X, Y, and Z, and actually say, here's the thing that I want. I want a religious language that describes and prescribes maybe who I am in the world, who I want to be in the world, and what I want the world that I live in to look like. And I want a community to create that language with. And I want a community to live that language with. And so I'm going to do it. And what else is out there? What else do people want for themselves? And by doing that, we'll create for others. We're pushing on one set of walls, right? One set of panels that are holding up our communal structures. There are so many other places for folks to push, to do whatever they're going to do to help start to shift our communities into places that are wide open and are places that are building a world, right? As cliche as maybe as it sounds sometimes in liberal or lefty circles, right? A world of overflowing kindness, a world of justice and equity, a world where we're all living with dignity.
Thank you both so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thanks, y'all.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. Before we give you all the different ways that you can be in touch with us with questions, thoughts, all of that good stuff, we wanted to remind you that next week, 8 days from when this episode is being released, on May 15th, that's Saturday, May 15th, and May 16th, Sunday, May 16th, we are having Shavuot Live, our 30-hour extravaganza. Dan mentioned it at the top. We are so excited to be welcoming some absolutely incredible folks to present and be in conversation with our attendees. It's going to be awesome. You can register at jewishlive.org/Shavuot. That's SHAVUOT. There's a link there where you can sign up. And we would love to see you there. It's going to be a fantastic time. We've got hundreds of folks already registered. You can join them. And now for those ways that you can be in touch with us, there's first our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. There's also Instagram and Twitter, which all those handles are at Judaism Unbound. You can head to our website, JudaismUnbound.com, and you can email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial contribution you can make, which you can do via judaismunbound.com/donate. And if you become a monthly patron, you can submit a question and have your voice on this podcast. We would love for you to do that, and we can't wait to welcome more listener questions in the future. We had our first one in our last episode. So thank you so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.